Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the European Union side events here at COP26 in Glasgow. My name is Mike Robinson. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. I was also the founder co-chair. Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the European Union side of Stop Climate Chaos Scotland. COP26 in Glasgow. And the co-chair of the Farming 1.5 inquiry into agriculture and net zero. Chief Executive of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. I was also the founder co-chair. And welcome to this session of the European Union. Okay, hopefully that's better. So, as I say, welcome to this session of the European Union side events. My name is Mike Robinson. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Scottish Geographical Society. Been involved in climate change for the last 20 plus years. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to Scotland for this critical global gathering. The people of Scotland are very proud of the leadership that we have shown on climate targets and on climate funding. And although we're a small nation, we hope that there's a lot of learning and expertise that we're keen to share with the wider world. And we hope others can draw some inspiration from what we've managed to do so far. Not, of course, that we've done enough, nobody has. But the people of Scotland expect great things from Glasgow COP26, some major steps in the right direction, a fair and just transition, significant funding for loss and damage and adaptation, and a voice for those less heard, and of course, a proper regard for nature. So please don't let us down. This afternoon's panel discussion is a joint event between the TAPCC, True Animal Protein Price Coalition, and Safari. The TAP Coalition is a coalition of health, farmers and youth organisations, animal welfare and environment organisations, social ventures and food companies working towards effective policy measures aimed at lower consumption of meat and dairy by introducing fair prices for meat and dairy products. It was established in 2018 in the Netherlands. The co-hosts this afternoon are Safari Scotland, a consortium of 6 globally renowned research institutes which collectively deliver the Scottish government-funded strategic research programme, which addresses key mid to longer term challenges for Scotland's environment, agriculture, land use, food and rural communities. Over the course of this next hour, we'll hear from 2 speakers, and then we'll open up to a panel discussion with a further 4 experts from a wide range of agricultural policy arenas. So if we can begin, our first speaker today is Jerome Remmers, who is the director of the TAP Coalition. So Jerome, over to you.
Thanks, Mike. And I think we first will start with a video, right? I hope the technical team is ready for it. It's yeah. Yes, thanks. I continue with the presentation. What you just saw was the proposal of TAP Coalition presented at the European Parliament 1.5 years ago. And some countries are really considering of doing such taxes on meat to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and use revenues of such a meat tax to support farmers with financial support to reduce emissions or improve animal welfare. So next slide. Yes, this is what is on the agenda now in Glasgow, the national determined contributions. What is going on is that a lot of countries have them for agriculture, but not for food. And this was shown by a report from World Wide Fund and UNEP last year, that no single country is having policies in their climate policies on sustainable diets and reducing consumption of meat or dairy. Next slide. And this is really strange because there's a lot of potential to do so. UNEP and World Wide Fund recommended to countries with red meat consumption higher than national dietary guidelines to do a lot. And most OECD countries have such a high meat consumption level. It's overconsumption in terms of health and of course also in terms of climate. So they advised countries with such situations to tax animal proteins. Next slide. And in the Netherlands, it showed that consumers are also supporting such proposals. There's a majority for it, according to a lot of inquiries. And not only for taxing meat, but also for other ways to reduce consumption of meat and dairy and increase plant-based food products in supermarkets. Next slide. So the problem with meat and dairy is that, of course, most of us like it. It's really tasty, but it causes 20% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And meat consumption in the world is growing by 4% per year. And this is not matching with the Paris climate goals. So we cannot continue in this way, and we need to do something about it. Otherwise, we will have a large problem. And also biodiversity loss globally is caused by 30 to 60% from meat and dairy consumption. So there's another reason to reduce consumption. Meat accounts for nearly 60% of all greenhouse gases from food production. So there is really a big elephant in the room, and nobody here in Glasgow likes to talk about it. Only a few countries did, like UK, which is a leader. The environmental minister, George Eustice, announced a carbon tax on meat and dairy, and using revenues to support farmers to reduce emissions. And he also said that a carbon border tax mechanism would also support farmers, because taxes from meat products coming from outside the UK will be taxed more. Next slide, please. This is the situation. Meat consumption as in a business as usual model will continue to grow, and so do the greenhouse gas emissions. In the world, Americans eat most meat, and other countries like Australia, New Zealand, Spain, Argentina, Brazil also do eat a lot of meat. And next slide. Here you see that 5 years ago, meat and dairy contributed 14% to the global greenhouse gas emissions. According to a university in America, now it's already 20%, and it will grow in 2030 up to 27%, and in 2050 to 81%, if we continue to eat more and more meat and dairy in the world. Next slide. So there is a solution. You can see it on futurefoodprice.org, and it's a tax. So we tax also fossil fuel, CO2, tobacco, alcohol. This really works to reduce consumption. And we have to think of clever ways to tax meat and use revenues also to the things we like to see. It could be used to reduce taxes on healthy food like vegetables and fruits, pay farmers for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and also compensating low-income groups. And because meat consumption should be not for the privileged rich persons. Next slide. So there was a letter written to 50 presidents of countries who consume most meat. This was done by the Carbon Pricing Food Coalition, and it was sent before the climate conference, and a lot of organizations and companies signed up to this open letter. So next slide, please. Here you can see some of the signatories. So over 5,000 companies and NGOs are represented here, including farmer and youth and food organizations, also some financial institutes and others. And in more than 100 countries are represented. So this letter is really supported a lot. We're just asking the presidents and their ministers to follow the leadership of UK and also other countries like Denmark and New Zealand, who already announced carbon pricing for meat and dairy. Next slide, please. So here you can see some countries who already decided to do it. And Germany and the Netherlands now had elections, but they are also considering to do it. And Spain already increased VAT tariffs on meat in 2012 and reduced VAT tariffs on vegetables and fruits. So there are examples of countries who did. And Denmark also recently said to tax carbon emissions from the agriculture sector and also using revenues to give financial incentives to them. And the Commission is also looking into a polluter pays principle proposal for the agri and food sector on greenhouse gas emissions, and it will be launched soon, according to their farm to fork strategy plans. Next slide. We are already introduced, but we can say that we represent a majority of voters in the Netherlands, but also in Germany and France. Next slide. Here you can see the results of a consumer survey in Germany and France. And according to the tax level, there's even a higher percentages of voters when the tax level is low, for instance, €1 per kilogram, then maybe 80% of consumers support it instead of 60%. Next slide. Yes, and this is how it looks like when a meat tax in the Netherlands will be introduced. Then beef will increase in price, pork even a little bit more relatively, and chicken a little bit less. But it can be on average 40% more expensive. And we hope our government will decide for it. Next slide. This can be the effect if all EU countries would do so. So it's a reduction of 3% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the EU, but it will also save a lot of healthcare costs, €9 billion in the EU, because of overconsumption of meat will be reduced, and so will health problems like diabetes 2, cancer, and other problems. And it can help also farmers. They can have a lot more subsidies from governments. And meat consumption can go down by 50% according to a study we commissioned. Next slide. Yes, here you can see the summary, what could happen with the meat tax. And this is very important, that it should not be just a meat tax, but how to use meat tax revenues to compensate farmers and consumers. So this was my presentation. So thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jerome. Before we move on to our second speaker, I understand we have a quick response to the open letter, which Jerome mentioned in his presentation, the one sent to 50 presidents and ministers to promote the issue of carbon pricing of food products. So we are joined by Lucas Dupré, who's from the Dutch Ministry of Agriculture, and it's going to take a brief moment just to respond on their behalf. So Lucas, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for offering me the floor. And Jerome, thank you very much for your presentation. And the presentation contained, of course, the open letter addressed to countless world leaders, from Presidents Putin and Biden to Prime Minister Rutte from the Netherlands. The letter calls for a true price for food by no longer passing on the external cost of meat and dairy to society, but by including them in the price by means of a tax. Currently, at the moment, as a consumer in the supermarket, we do not see what the production of meat and dairy means for the living environment. At least you don't see its negative impact in the price of the product. In that case, prices sometimes hide more than they actually reveal. True pricing, in your letter referred to as carbon pricing, but in principle the same thing, makes things transparent. Hidden costs are made public. And the role of true pricing to reach sustainability goals is a very interesting approach. The world is facing major challenges, as we see here in Glasgow. We have climate problems, severe climate problems, and we are crossing ecological and environmental boundaries. So your open letter comes at the right time, and I really hope that your effort and also the open letter will result in more engagement by all actors who have a stake in this. Again, thank you very much for presenting this, and I hope to further discuss this topic, and looking forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucas. Thanks for that. Okay, we come on to our second speaker. I'm delighted we have been joined by Helena Wright, Policy Director for FAIRR, where she focuses on policy solutions related to the risks and opportunities surrounding intensive animal agriculture. The FAIRR initiative is a collaborative investor network that raises awareness of the environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities brought about by intensive livestock production. With offices in London, they help investors integrate these risks and opportunities into their investment decision-making and active stewardship processes. Helena, the stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Mike, for the introduction. So I'm Dr. Helena Wright. I'm the Policy Director at FAIR. And as you mentioned, we're an investor network supported by investors with more than 45 trillion in assets under management, focused on the ESG risks and opportunities in the agriculture sector. And I would like to point out that, agriculture is responsible to a really large proportion of global emissions. In fact, the wider global food system accounts for around a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. But actually, FAIR's research has found that more than 80% of the largest protein producer companies, that means meat, dairy and aquaculture companies, are actually failing to declare or set reduction targets in terms of all of their greenhouse gas emissions. But there is actually a lot of opportunities for producer companies to reduce their emissions and to be part of the solution, and also for agriculture to become a net carbon sink instead of a source of emissions. So really, actually at FAIR, what we are proposing is for policymakers to sort of internalize those externalities from an investor perspective. That will help the investors who have already made large sort of commitments in terms of aligning their investments with climate and with biodiversity risk. And we know that agriculture as well is actually one of the most vulnerable sectors to the impacts of climate change as well. So it's not just, the risks in terms of creating climate change risks. There's also the risk for actually food security, food production to be negatively affected. And in that regard, I'd like to actually also welcome the announcements this week regarding the global methane pledge. So many countries have now committed to reduce their methane emissions by 30% by 2030. And that's been highlighted as really critical by many scientists in order to avoid some of the most serious tipping points in the climate system. Although I think most focus this week has been on sort of fossil fuel emissions, which are obviously important in methane as well. We are also seeing a focus now on the agricultural emissions. So it varies around the world, but for example, in the US, livestock is the largest source of methane emissions. So there will now be a lot of attention on this issue, I believe, to actually tackle the greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector. So it's really great to be here today. I also wanted to mention that we also launched an investor statement basically calling for greater transparency in terms of agricultural emission reduction targets. And as was just mentioned by Lucas Dupre, so transparency is a very important issue as well when it comes to both consumers, but also investors to see the emissions effects. And our investor statement actually called for the G20 governments to provide more transparency about the agricultural emission reduction targets that they will be committing to. And that will actually provide for a more managed transition to a sustainable system. What we don't want to see is sort of large shocks within the system that will create disruption. It would be better if government would provide a more managed transition and actually shift agricultural subsidies more towards a sustainable system. So that means supporting farmers and supporting producers to produce products in a more sustainable way, which will act as a signal towards the market to a more sustainable agricultural system. I'll leave it there, but thanks. It's great to be here today.
Thanks, Helena. And 45 trillion is a lot of money. You can do a lot of good with that. Okay, we do have, I think anybody who wishes to put a question in, please try and use the Slido tool that we have. We have posed a question for you there. I'd like to add that in this country, we've become very wary of referenda, but knock yourself out. So do please fill out the question if you get a chance. And if we can come to that later, we will. However, we've also now been joined by a number of other experts. And so we're going to begin with an expert panel discussion. Can I start by introducing them along with Jerome and Helena, who you've already met? We have Jana Fremming from the Environmental Action, Germany. We have Stephen Thompson, an agricultural research economist with the Scotland's Rural College and a member of the Farming 1.5 inquiry looking at the future of Scottish agriculture moving to net zero. And Martin Kennedy, who is the president of the National Farmers Union of Scotland. So I'd like to start really just by giving each of our panel a chance to respond to the presentations they've seen. So Martin, perhaps you'd like to kick off.
Thank you very much, Mike, and welcome everybody to Scotland on what I would say is a typical summer's day, actually, when it's pouring rain. And it's something we're used to and something we take for granted all the time. Excellent presentations, both from Jerome and Helena. And it's probably maybe one of the only panelists here that is at the coalface of this, shall we say, if you pardon the pun. But the reality is we're the ones that are going to have to act on this from an agricultural perspective. And given the concerns on meat taxes and how we actually price that, just as an example, the backdrop, incidentally, that's behind me is the farm where I farm here. We're at the farm at 800 feet. We go to 2,500 feet. We're at 100% a livestock farm. And I'm very concerned to a certain degree about how if we put a tax on meat, we risk, and we have to be very careful that we don't actually put a tax on biodiversity and the environment as well. Because the environment that's behind me is actually being created by livestock. We know, and I am absolutely at the forefront of this along with the Scottish Government, looking at new policies, how we can improve on this. Completely accept there is a big issue with methane that we have to address. And I am of the view that agriculture will play a massive part to the solution in this. But I think we have to be very careful that a one size fits all is maybe not the case right across the globe. So as I said right at the start, when it comes to meat and dairy, in the UK, 90% of the water we use is rainwater. So from a Scottish perspective, it's actually greater than that when it comes to producing meat and dairy. Again, when it comes to the environment, the biodiversity that we actually create, livestock plays a large part in that, and including creating greater organic matter. We want to improve in our soils, our peatlands that are grazed properly. That grazing management is really important. However, that doesn't mean to say that we can't do more. And agriculture will have to play and take its fair share of the heavy lifting when it comes to this. But looking at efficiencies through better breeding management, through technologies, looking at methane inhibitors, I think the whole sector is up for that. And I'm sure the sector across the globe are up for that. But given one of the things that we've got to address is also food security, and speaking to other members at COP over this last week, and I'm sure next week as well, food security is increasingly going to be important. So we have actually got three things to address here at the same time. One is climate change for obvious reasons. The other one's the environment. But the one that probably links the two of these together is food production. So that's why I think farmers need to be at the core of this right across the globe. And I think we've got to be very mindful that we don't have a one size fits all. If we can produce red meat in a sustainable manner, in areas of the world that can be done and we can improve on the efficiencies of that, then I think from a health benefit as well, we know there's a number of academics out there, medical academics, that are concerned maybe in a few years' time of the lack of red meat intake that could be concerned. So I think we've got to take very much a holistic approach here, but without any doubt about it, agriculture is very keen to be part of that solution.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, I thought I would ask Jana for your thoughts and responses to that, and maybe also to what Martin's been saying too.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. I'm Jana Fremming from Environmental Action Germany. And starting with Jerome, I totally support your approach and the idea that it's important to reduce consumption and therefore work on the consumption patterns. And Helena, I agree with you that we especially need to look at companies and big polluters, since, for example, in the EU, most of the pollution comes from big animal farms. And Martin, I also agree with you that we need to support at the same time producers to be able to produce sustainably. And therefore, it is an important approach. And at the same time, for example, in Germany, we already see that consumption is decreasing while production stays stable. So there is a need even for additional approaches. And in this regard, economic instruments can play an important role that address production as well. In the German context, we as Environmental Action Germany, we propose pricing emissions at farm level. So the proposal is that the emission levy starts from a certain threshold and then progressively increases. So the threshold is animal numbers, a sustainable number of animals according to your available land. So this means that if you are in a healthy state of animal numbers according to your available land, you will not get charged, while the bigger you are, the more burdened you get according to your land, yeah? So the money should be put into a fund and channeled back to the farmers. So this causes that small farmers with a healthy ratio of animals to the available area will get support, while big polluters, big animal farms will receive incentives to get smaller and reduce animal numbers. So this can be a push forward to the overall transformation of the sector with a variety of co-benefits, less animal numbers in a healthy state, so that in the end we have farms that are able to produce sustainable and produce quantity instead of quality, that can make a living from their production, that can feed only regional fodder with closed cycles. And to achieve this, we definitely need less consumption and address it. We need to address production as well. We need economic instruments, probably a mix of economic instruments, and we need supporting regulatory law and subsidies that are invested in or that are there for pushing forward sustainable production, for example, from the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU.
Brilliant, thank you, Jana. And Stephen.
Hi, Mike, and thanks for the invite to speak here today. Where do I start? An awful lot of things for people to absorb there. My understanding was George Eustace on the TV yesterday said that there would be no red meat tax in the UK, but did talk about carbon border tax. He would not commit to a red meat tax at all. So just to clarify on that front, if I go back to the point made by Jana immediately there on scales of production, we have to actually remember that in terms of GHG efficiency, some of the larger producers are actually the most climate friendly in terms of their emissions. Now, whilst there might be other environmental consequences in terms of pollution, associated with large-scale intensive production, in terms of their carbon footprinting, they can't be the most efficient. So we have to be really careful when we make generalizations. And I in this whole debate, I find an awful lot of generalizations in that some meat is actually lower carbon production than others. So there's some beef that is very low carbon compared with others. And how do we start differentiating between them? So it was interesting to hear what Lucas was saying, where he was sort of advocating a Pigouvian tax, where all externalities are actually priced. And I suppose if you are going down that route, then you have to then start talking about externalities of all food production and all other systems. So cement, oil, cars that we're traveling in, crops and non-livestock production. So there's a whole series of moral and ethical questions that you have to ask yourself in here when you start taking certain approaches and cherry picking one or t'other. I do agree with everyone that we do consume too much red meat. In the UK, we're a massive net importer of red meat, and particularly on beef. We're an exporter of sheep meat. So the balance in the UK terms is not there. And like Martin, whose farm is nice and low ground in comparison with where I come from, the scene behind me is where I come from in the hills. And this is a plantation, a woodland plantation on peatland, which should never have happened because it's probably releasing as much emissions from plantation on deep peat than anywhere else. So we have to be really, really smart in how we address this climate issue. Somehow signaling for consumers to reduce their emissions, but actually having sort of more responsible consumption. How does a consumer decide what they're eating? Is it sustainable? What is the carbon footprint of that piece of meat or that piece of chicken? And until we do that, then we are stuck with pretty blunt tools, which are generic taxes. And if you look at the elasticities of demand, then it takes quite a hefty tax to actually stimulate the changes that's needed. And I would just finally back up what Martin's saying is agri-tech will probably take us a long way there. We've got colleagues in the college that are looking at the gut biome of ruminant livestock to actually help select for low methane production. And they're talking about some cows are 50% lower methane emissions than others. So there's a lot of opportunity, and hopefully some of Elena's 45 trillion investors can actually start investing in some of the solutions.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, before we go to a couple of the questions from the public, Jerome, do you want to respond to some of Martin and Stephen and Jana's comments?
Yes, the remark from Stephen about some meat production is better than others in terms of emissions. That's right. And in the ideal world, this should be included into tax proposals. But for tax authorities, this will be really complicated if every farmer gets a different tax bill. And in addition to that, our proposal is that there will be a consumer tax per kilogram meat. So there we might consider to maybe exclude some types of meat or maybe organic meat, but this is just a discussion we will have within our own organization. Because there are also other reasons to not tax organic meat too much because of animal welfare reasons. But I think in general we can account what is the general emissions per kilogram beef, pork, or dairy, and then tax it, and then redistribute the revenues to the farmers who have the lowest carbon emissions, so and highest animal welfare levels. So in this way, we want to stimulate the farmers who do the right things, and of course, all farmers are doing their best. So not, there are no good and bad farmers, but we want to give the right incentives to have a better production.
Thanks, Jerome. And Helena, obviously, direct challenge there from Stephen about investment. So have you got any thoughts based on what they were saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, really interested to participate in this. I mean, definitely, I agree that a sort of mixed approach is needed really in terms of the policy levers, in terms of the tools that can be used to address the issues and support a sustainable transition for agriculture. And also one very interesting technology which a lot of investors are looking at in the agri-tech space is obviously alternative protein as well. So even some of the really largest protein producer companies in the world are now sort of diversifying into plant-based meat alternative substitutes. Some of the sort of largest global players in the meat space are now sort of looking at alternative protein. So that's another really interesting aspect to agri-tech, which we're seeing emerging in the market at the moment. And it's interesting to see also in Scotland recently, there was a sort of Scottish Oat Milk Producer Association set up as well. Obviously Scotland being a good environment for oat production as well. So that's another quite interesting area. What we're missing, I think, is a bit more transparency. So both for investors and sort of in terms of the policy environment as well. We're lacking the data about the greenhouse gas emissions and the carbon and biodiversity impacts. And we're also lacking a sort of pathway in the roadmap that we need to see globally. So that's an area which we need further research. And actually what would be helpful is to have a sort of roadmap for agriculture and land use that not only aligns with climate, but also aligns with nature and food security as well. So those factors that were all mentioned. And I think what that will probably show, I mean, based on the research that's out there, is that we need lower numbers of livestock overall, and then regenerative systems, as well as sort of protein diversification. So whilst we don't sort of have those numbers, I think we know that there's a mixture of solutions that have been discussed already. And what would be really helpful is to have a bit more clarity, both from policy and from the market as well.
Thanks, Helena. So a bit more of a roadmap, but we don't want to spend all of our time creating a baseline and not getting on with it. Jana, so did you have any thoughts? And then we'll start taking the first of the questions. So Jana, did you want to respond to anything you've heard?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, thank you for giving me the floor. Stephen, I would like to respond to your statement that big farms are often the most efficient. I agree that there are efficiency advances of big farms, but look at the numbers in the EU. 70% of methane emissions come from big animal farms, and 80% of ammonia emissions comes from farms, from 4% of all farms, which is the biggest farms. So we need to really look at these big super emitters. And yeah, in the end, we need to bind available land to the number of animals to achieve the necessary methane emission, especially, and the other greenhouse gases and pollutants as well.
Thanks, Jana. Okay, Martin, your chance to come back on that first, and then Stephen, I'll come back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think we've got to remember that it comes back to my earlier point about it's not a one size fits all. These figures you're quoting, Jana, are obviously global figures, and from a Scottish perspective, the sort of sizes of herd size, flock size is not the same. For example, I mean, we're 85% what we classify less favoured area in Scotland. And without livestock production and trying to produce food sustainably, that's a challenge, because how would we produce food on a lot of that land that we have here? If we didn't have livestock to a degree that keeps the surroundings, like what's behind Stephen, what's behind myself, in check, one of the biggest carbon release issues we see is wildfires, and grazing livestock and keeping likes of backdrops behind me, myself, in that sort of carbon sequestrating state is down to livestock production. And I again accept the fact we need to do more, but given the fact that in the UK at the minute we're actually only 60% self-sufficient in food production, it's quite a worrying statistic. And I think when it comes to if we can produce it sustainably, that's where we need to get the help from governments to incentivise farmers to do things in a different manner, using that technology that Stephen's talking about, using better breeding techniques. All these things I think is in favour. But where we can do this, where we have a natural environment that livestock can assist with biodiversity and the environment, I think we have to be very careful we don't have a detrimental impact on having too little livestock in some of these areas. A lot of our environmental organisations are concerned. A long number of years ago, we were overstocked seriously in Scotland, because then it was driven by policy and headage payments. Now there's some real concerns about understocking in a lot of areas. We don't want to see wildfires and such like taking place in a lot of the areas in Scotland. And we do actually get some dry years in Scotland. It's not always days like this. So we do get some dry years when you can have that effect. But just wanted to come back on that. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Martin. And Stephen, before we come to you, I'm going to bring Jerome in because he's only got 3% left on his battery.
Yes, what is your question?
Well, you can either respond or you can actually start with the first proper question that we've had in, which was this issue about between promoting vegetarianism and increasing taxes on meat products, which do you think will be more effective to reduce meat consumption?
Yeah, I really believe in the power of financial incentives, because they proved to work. And according to science, this is also the best way to realize the greenhouse gas emission targets and the health targets for the food sector. This was also a discussion in the UN Food System Summit a few months ago. And politicians want to subsidize products, and they prefer this option. But in terms of realizing policy goals, taxing products with negative impact on health or environment should be preferred. And they of course, diets with vegetarian diets can also help a lot. But only a small amount of people will stick to it, and this goes slow. But while with taxing meat products or sugar taxes, or all population is included in this proposal, and it will have more effects.
Thank you, Jerome. Okay, I'm delighted that we've been joined by Elizabeth Gulagulu, who's from Zimbabwe, the co-chair of the Youngo Food and Agriculture Working Group, and from the African Youth Initiative on Climate Change. Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us. I understand you've had some Wi-Fi problems, which is another one of these issues about making sure that people get a voice. So, Elizabeth, do you want to speak? Would you like to give a perspective? Okay, we'll come back to Elizabeth in a minute. Obviously, still having Wi-Fi problems. Okay, Stephen, you've been very patient over there. I do apologise. So do make your points in reference to the previous comments, and also perhaps reflect on that question about whether vegetarianism being promoted or taxes are the way to do this, take this forward.
I'll answer the question first, which is I'm in total agreement with Jerome here, in that I think it's been demonstrated in past that promotion of and information doesn't actually give the results that are required. If you look at alcohol and cigarettes, tobacco, and the influence, information about the health benefits or disbenefits of them certainly didn't get us as far as we need. So the government have intervened with taxing, and it's going to be likely the same on food. If I just come back to this whole thing about pricing, carbon pricing, etc. For me, we've got to be really careful here, because we are giving farmers in the European Union and other parts of the world, we're giving farmers quite a lot of support in order to actually maintain incomes because of fluctuating market prices, etc., whatever the justifications are. And we should be utilising that as much as we can to drive the behavioural change. We know from past experience in the European Union, farmers will follow that money, that support money, and they will work within the bounds and the rules that will set. We've also got the retail sector. The retail sector announced at COP that they were going to go net zero by 2030. We've also got a banking sector that support the farming sector through lending quite large sums of money in some instances, saying that they're going to go to net zero and they're going to decarbonize emissions. So we've got a three-pronged attack here before we even get to a tax on meat that will actually drive and stimulate behavioural change within the system. And if we can actually devise a set of policy signals, which we're trying to do in Scotland, and we've been trying to promote to the Scottish Government how to do this, in terms of signalling that you get higher tiered payments if you have low emission intensities or low overall emissions, and the same with biodiversity. So we're trying to take this in a three-pronged attack on food, which answers Martin's problems of food security, on sustainable food production that has also got positive biodiversity. Where the carbon tax would come in, I'm not 100% sure, given that we've not tried a proper signalling approach in the European Union, where there is significant policy money going into agriculture. That is not, the conditionality measures that we've got just now are not adequate and need to be improved.
Thanks, Stephen. Jan, I'll maybe come to you. There is a sort of specific question here, but is there a danger of excluding some groups if we start taxing meats and taxing proteins, or is that something we can accommodate or account for in the way that this is delivered?
This for me. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, is there actually a danger of excluding some groups from being able to afford meat?
Yes, we have to really assure that the money we invest in agriculture, we invest in livestock farming, we generate by emission taxes, by meat taxes, that we either support farmers on the one side, support farmers to make a living, to be able to invest in the sustainable transformation, and as well support, which is actually one of Jerome's approaches too, or criteria, that we support the low-income groups so that they can still afford meat and dairy.
Okay, thank you, Jana. There is a question in here, but I feel it's more for Lucas actually than the rest of the panel. Is the Dutch government planning to propose any sort of unsustainable food tax, or is any government indeed? But Lucas, if you're still there, maybe you could respond to that. Just give him a moment to see if he's away from his desk. Lucas.
Yeah, still here, but moving on the move. Transportation, so I'll keep the video off if that's all right. Could you please repeat the question one more? Sorry for that.
Of course. Is the Dutch government planning to propose any sort of unsustainable food tax?
Well, the situation at the moment in the Netherlands is that we're in the formation of a new government. So all these kinds of topics are on the table over there. So at the moment, we have no final answer on issues like that. So that's a very hard question for me to answer at this moment. You have to come back to me in a couple of months to have a decent answer for that one.
Excellent. We'll reconvene in 2 months. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Helena.
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to sort of echo the really important points made about agricultural subsidies there and just touch on that topic as well, because I mean, there was a report a couple of months ago out by the UN Environment Programme, for example, that found that globally there's more than 400 billion agricultural subsidies per year that are defined as harmful. and what we can actually do. One of the most important levers for a sustainable transition for agricultural system will actually be aligning those subsidies better with climate and with nature, and also, with other public goods as well. But I think that's a really important aspect that we need to have greater focus on. So it's great to see a number of coalitions sort of forming around that topic, and some comments made earlier this week as well by Germany's agricultural ministry as well, about how they're sort of repurposing their agricultural subsidies. And actually, this is an important topic for investors because, as mentioned just now, a lot of investors are committing to net zero within their investments, but they can't sort of achieve those goals alone. They do need policymakers to act. And that's why actually earlier on this year, there was a letter sent by a number of investors to the European Commission, actually calling for the European Commission to better align its common agricultural policy with both climate and nature. So it would be great to see further action on that topic within the years ahead as well.
Thanks, Helena. Okay, Jerome, you still got battery?
Yes, 1% left, but I know that 2 of the 4 government parties, political parties in the Netherlands, support the meat tax proposal, and one is D66, the second largest party. So I'm hopeful that this time there will come a proposal to do it, as also the majority of Dutch voters support it.
Thanks, Jerome. Martin.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's really just, again, supporting what Jerome said and Helena about policy and, future policy and incentivising, farmers to take that direction to try and comply with or be part of that solution when it comes to the climate mitigation. Well, we're seeing that already. Scotland's had some quite big moves. We're moving away from tillage in the arable sector. We need that arable sector to be able to produce. We've only got 8-9% of our farmed land in Scotland is what we call prime agricultural land that can actually be very productive. So we want that to produce, but we're seeing a shift in how that's done, a move to sort of minimum till, zero till. That's happening. And it's not maybe the right thing for everybody, but it's happening in a moving feast. And again, when it comes to our grasslands, we want to be able to produce that sort of high density protein, high quality protein in our grasslands in Scotland. But it's how we do it. So it's actually how we do that, and it's incentivised, and that's where, as Jerome and Elena said about the policy, the incentive, how we can do that with future policy. And I think that's what's very important. The governments are part of this, but farmers are as well. So it needs to be that sort of collaboration between the two, that we're going to share that same goals when it comes to climate change mitigation and environmental enhancement. So it's about how that policy is driven, and farmers will follow where that support's going. Because at the minute, there's not enough there to get it back from the marketplace to keep us profitable. And if without profitable agriculture, again, that makes it really challenging to address the challenges and the targets we'll have ahead of us. So it's really just to, let's what we can do sustainably. Let's focus on the areas we can produce high quality, produce that high quality dense protein in our good grasslands in Scotland, and use our arable lands, but just do it in a different manner that actually addresses the challenges we have. So I think I'm always optimistic. I'm always upbeat. I think agriculture has got a positive role to play here, and this is probably as much an opportunity as it is a challenge. But I think we need that incentives to be in play.
Oh, very good, Martin. And I think, I would agree with that opportunity as well as challenge. I think the big challenge is, as we run out of time, we want to see things happen quickly. And how do you bring people with you at the same time as meeting that urgency? Which does reflect on one of the questions we've had, that there is a need for a public education campaign to change consumption and cultural habits. Will part of the taxes that are collected, should they be directed at education? I'm actually delighted that Elizabeth has joined us. So, hello, Elizabeth. Very nice to have you here. Great to have you with us. Do you want to just say hi and give a quick perspective from Zimbabwe before we, because we're not far away from wrapping up, actually. So this is your chance to say what you'd like out of this.
Thank you so much. I am sorry for the background noise. It's been pretty hectic, and the network hasn't been that good to me. But yeah, as you have heard, that I'm from Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe heavily depends highly on agriculture. And we currently in Zimbabwe, agriculture is the most sector that is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. and measures are being put in place through making sure that there's a lot of research and a lot of capacity when it comes to farmers in terms of producing cow feed. The reason why there is a lot of research that is happening and a lot of resources that needs to be invested in this kind of spaces, because we really cannot separate the feed that we give to our animals to greenhouse gas emissions, because if the feed is of low quality, it means that there is more greenhouse gas emissions that are getting into our atmosphere. But if the feed is of good quality, it means that even the GHG emissions are sort of like reduced. So this is also what the Zimbabwean government has been working on, and issues to do with livestock and farming, they've been greatly mainstreamed into our nationally determined contributions. And young people are also on the forefront, not only as farmers, but also as policymakers, also as technical experts, making sure that we are all on the same page in terms of the agriculture, forest, and other land uses. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And I'm so sorry you're unable to join us earlier, but lovely to have you here. So we are into the last 5 minutes. What would you like from COP26?
Well, COP26, us as the Children and Youth Constituency to the UNFCCC, we have been following the negotiations under agriculture, which are commonly known as the Coronavia Joint Work on Agriculture. And our expectations for COP26 is to make sure that issues to do with agriculture should be linked with food systems. We cannot talk about best agricultural practices without talking about sustainable diets, without talking about plant-based diets, without talking about proper environmental conservation and agroecological practices. We hope that COP27, these issues will be mainly mainstream, since COP27 will be coming to Africa, whereby we are saying the whole continent heavily depends on agriculture. But this COP26, this is what we generally expect, that massive advocacy on the importance of agroecological practices and making sure that we use an inclusive approach whereby we leave no person behind in terms of policy advocacy. Women, young people, people with disabilities, all those people are important in the discourse of agriculture. Thank you.
And thank you, Elizabeth. Jana, same question to you. What would you like at COP26?
I really welcome, like Helena does too, the Global Methane Pledge, which was launched at COP26. And this is a good starting point now that more than 100 countries signed and committed themselves to cut methane emissions by 30% until 2030. So now we need action, and the first step within the EU is to achieve binding targets for methane, and at national level too. So it is crucial there further to include the agricultural sector with concrete targets and concrete measures in the national strategies. And like Martin also said before, we need to make use of the technology which is already available. There's a variety on the table yet. And since it's not enough only to apply the technology, we need to start reduce livestock numbers and work on the consumption patterns and make use of the economic instruments and other approaches we just talked about.
Thank you, Jana. And Helena, what would you like to see? If you just come off mute.
Apologies, I was muted there. So for what we would like to see, I think, from COP26 is a greater attention on this issue. Otherwise, it does become more of a risk for the investment community as well as globally. And I'd just actually like to echo some of the comments made so far actually about the focus on this issue, really welcoming the methane reduction pledges that have been made. We do need greater transparency on the agricultural emission topic within the NDC commitments, and also the role of climate resilience as well in agriculture is an important topic as well. So what would be good to see actually is a greater focus on agriculture and food systems at the next COP. I know others have been calling for this as well, but it was sort of disappointing in a way to see that there wasn't a specific agriculture day at COP26. it would be good to see for COP27 a greater focus on the important issue of food systems. And just to echo what others have said, actually on the 30 by 30, there's another important process underway on the biodiversity goals as well. So the other 30 by 30 commitment, in fact, is the protection of 30% of nature by 2030 as well. So it would be important to see those considerations looking at both climate and nature together, in which case agriculture is going to be an important component of that for the next COP process.
Brilliant. Thank you, Helena. I think we're probably going to have to wrap up there. I just want to say thank you to everybody for tuning in, for all of our speakers, Jerome, Helena, Elizabeth, Stephen, Martin, Jana, and Lucas. And just to echo, I think that from Scotland, we want to see the most ambitious and accelerated decision-making process we can possibly see. And obviously, we would like to see COP26 be as successful as possible. But yes, but good luck when it comes to Africa next year as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining in. Thank you, all of our panelists, and have a lovely rest of your afternoon, evening.